Good morning. Welcome to Backchat. I'm Danny Gittings. Your co-host this morning is Andrew Work. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Danny.
Welcome back to the show. In our main topic this morning, we'll be asking what is the future for radical pan-democratic groups now that most of their members have been effectively banned from standing for the Legislative Council following the disqualification of by-election candidate Agnes Chow. Will the radicals abandon electoral politics and take to the streets again? Perhaps even try and organise some sort of rerun of the umbrella movement? Or will disheartened radicals lose interest in politics and give up altogether, prompting the protest groups that have emerged over the last few years to fade away? And just how far will the ban on who is allowed to stand for election spread? Will those who oppose national security legislation be the next to be disqualified from standing, on the grounds that this means they refuse to uphold Article 23 of the Basic Law? Email us with your thoughts. Our email address, backchat@rthk.hk. That's backchat@rthk.hk. Or you can go to our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio Free, and leave a comment there. Or give us a call. The number 233-88-266. That's 233-88-266. And later in the programme, more money to tackle what nurses are calling a war zone in local hospitals. Joining us for the main segment of the show this morning, we have Richard Ip. Richard Ip is a barrister and member of the Progressive Lawyers Group. We have Lawrence Ma. Lawrence Ma is a barrister, chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. And we now also have Nathan Law. Nathan Law, chairman of Demosisto. And, of course, a disqualified legislator. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Let's just remind us, we are talking about the events following on from the disqualification of Agnes Chan in the Hong Kong Island constituency. The candidates in the Hong Kong Island constituency, Judy Chan from the New People's Party, Edward Yum, Au Nok Him, Dick Ng, and Johnny Ma. Okay. Nathan Law, good morning. Let's go to you first. What is the future for Demosisto? I mean, you won't be able to stand for election again, will you now, after this ruling of the returning officer, nor will anyone else in your party. So electoral politics is now out of the window as far as you're concerned.
Well, yes, it is quite obvious that from the explanation from the returning officer that Demosisto's member may not be able to join the electoral politics in the future. But that's not the only part of our organization. We still keep working in the community, in the international community, and also working very closely with the civic society. So I think there are still different ways that Demosisto could develop. And I believe that even though the returning officer disqualify or bar our candidates, but they just cannot take away the support from the mass public. So I think we still got a long road in terms of fighting in the democratic road.
But yeah, Nathan, the Democratic side in Hong Kong has got a long history of breaking apart and reforming under different names. Do you think you could kind of shed a couple of candidates, give them slap a new party name on them, and regroup and come back at LegCo elections?
Well, I think it is still quite early to talk on that because it's just happened for a few days. But I think well, one thing I would like to mention is even though they block us from participating in the election, it doesn't mean that we will give up on fighting democracy. We'll definitely work on different paths in achieving that.
You were talking about rallying international support and things like that. You're not talking about more radical action. Right now, right after Agnes Chow was disqualified, Leung Kwok Hung said that Hong Kong people should stop paying their taxes in protest. You don't support that kind of protest, right?
Well, I think we need to explore more because that is a very organized and massive campaign, civil disobedience, so that I'm not by nature objecting that, but I just think that even for the inner core of the democratic camp, we still need more discussion on that.
Oh, after the Occupy movement, you and many others made this decision to go into electoral politics, to stand for the Legislative Council, and now that route is cut off from you. Does it make civil disobedience more likely?
Oh, well, I think it just shows how outrageous the government is, because the action of barring the Democratic candidate definitely violating the International Convention on Civic and Political Rights, depriving our political rights. So that even though that's the path after the umbrella movement, I don't think that it shows a failure on that. We'll still keep fighting in different area in the democratic movement.
You're not really talking about civil disobedience here. It sounds to me like maybe you sense the mood in Hong Kong is that the time for civil disobedience is gone, or is not the mood now.
Well, definitely the mood has to be developed. I don't think that for any single minute there will be enough people ready for civil disobedience. But at the end of the day, if the government shows no response to any other means, then for a lot of people, the last resort to force is by civil disobedience.
Yeah. Okay, we're discussing the future for pan-democratic groups following the disqualification of Agnes Chow. You just heard Nathan Law, the chairman of Demosisto. Do stay with us as we continue the discussion. If you have any thoughts, email us at backchat@rthk.hk. That's backchat@rthk.hk. We can go to our Facebook page, Backchat and RTHK Radio Free, and leave a comment there. Another issue that's coming up, and I think Nathan Law has raised this before, is just how far the ban on standing for LegCo could extend. Now, yesterday on this program, a number of the guests on this program suggested that if you're opposed to Article 23 of the Basic Law, well, that's part of the Basic Law as well. So if you don't uphold that, you shouldn't be allowed to stand for LegCo. And Executive Councillor Ronnie Tong has made comments in a similar vein as well. To discuss this side of the issue, we're also joined by two lawyers, as I mentioned earlier, Lawrence Ma from the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation and Richard Ip from the Progressive Lawyers Group. Lawrence Ma, let's go to you first.
Good morning, Danny.
Good morning. On this Article 23 issue, Article 23 is part of the Basic Law. If you're against it, you can't uphold the Basic Law, right or wrong?
Well, technically correct.
Technically correct. So
correct.
That could disqualify a lot of people if you're so minded.
Well, yes. If you interpret the obligation to uphold the Basic Law in such a way, yes. I mean, if you uphold the Basic Law, you have to uphold all the provisions in the Basic Law.
How about people that say we don't like this version of legislation to enact Article 23, or we don't think the time is now for Article 23? Does it have to be we must have it now?
True. It is a matter of fact and degree, I would say. If you go outright opposing any Article 23 legislations, it could be interpreted as opposing the entire in its entirety Article 23. But if you're saying the timetable is not time for it, provide explanation for it, you might be exempted. Just like Legislative Councillor nominee Mr. Im.
How about a financial secretary who wants to run a budget deficit or grow the size of the government spending beyond the growth in the GDP? Because that's also in the Basic Law, and Paul Chan says he might be in a mood to do that in the next budget.
Matter of fact and degree.
Yeah.
Okay, we're discussing how far the ban on standing for election could extend, particularly on the issue of Article 23. You just heard Lawrence Ma, the barrister chair of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Let me bring in a comment from a listener here on this theme, and then we'll go to Richard Ip. Because, as I said, this discussion started on our show yesterday, and Philippe, messaging after the show ended, said, I take strong exception to this view on disqualification from Article 23, originally put by Phyllis Kwong, a guest yesterday. Ms. Kwong would disqualify from elected LegCo office any person who opposes Article 23 legislation. The reason there's not yet any Article 23 legislation is because a majority of Hong Kong people oppose such legislation. I accordingly can think of no more fit representative for Hong Kong population than a legislator who opposes such legislation. Clearly, Ms. Kwong and her ilk believe LegCo represents first and foremost the central government, not Hong Kong citizens. Thank you very much, and we'll be bringing in more listeners' comments as we go on through the show. Richard Ip, your comments on the issue of disqualification of people who oppose Article 23.
Yes, I think it's a worrying trend, but I think if you apply proper analysis, Western common law legal analysis, that just can't be possible. It's a gross infringement of people's freedom of expression. Because you say something, then you are disqualified.
Well,
I just don't see how that's in accordance with how we see the Basic Law. And
I'm not advocating this. It's part of the Basic Law as well, isn't it? Upholding the Basic Law means upholding it all of it. Article 23 is part of the Basic Law.
yes, but it doesn't mean that I can't express my disagreements or with certain details or even with certain articles about how they should implement it in Hong Kong.
But really, this is the big problem, is that the basic law, kind of gives us broad guidelines, and then we enact legislation to articulate what it means. But, the way the returning officers are working now is they've got a lot of latitude to decide what contravenes the basic law.
Exactly. I think that's a serious problem, because the returning officer is basically doing a job of a political appointee and doing some political censoring.
Nathan Law, you were one of the first, I think, at the press conference on Saturday, immediately after Agnes Chow's disqualification, to raise this issue of how far will the ban on candidates extend. What are your concerns? We mentioned Article 23. Are there other areas where you're worried people might be banned?
Well, I think the most worrying trend is the way they examine the threshold of so-called upholding the basic law. Is changing constantly, and there's no clear standard how they could define it. If you take a close look into the basic law, there are mechanism for amending the basic law. The Chinese Constitution has been amended for several times. So if you agree that there are room for amending the basic law, so why can't we? On the one hand, upholding basic law, but on the other hand, advocating there's some amendment in the basic law. So if the government is trying to use a very narrow threshold of upholding the basic law, which means you cannot, you cannot disagree any certain ordinance or article in the basic law, then I don't think the way we are discussing it is appropriate, because if today, even though it is not the Article 23, then there are the other article for the government to propose, because there's no clear standard, or there's no an objective testing on the way whether people upholding the basic law.
Yeah, Danny, you wrote the book. How many articles are there in the basic law?
160.
160
articles. There's a lot of articles to uphold, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like the one that I raised, like the M1,
you
the
mentioned
107
about on balanced budget, but that's phrased in more tentative language. So,
but it's all in tentative language.
Leeway on that. Yes, well, that is an issue very strong. Okay, we're discussing issues following on from the disqualification of a Demosisto candidate Agnes Chow on the Hong Kong Island constituency. If you've got any thoughts related to these issues, do email us at backchat@rthk.hk. It's backchat@rthk.hk. Go to our Facebook page, Backchat and RTHK Radio Free, and leave a comment there. Let's bring in a couple of comments now from some of our most regular listeners most regularly commenting. First of all, Bowen. Bowen says, following on from yesterday's discussion, by not giving Agnes Chow the chance to explain what she or her party meant by self-determination, the returning officer breached well-established principles of natural justice. And because of that, her final decision was erroneous. What is equally clear is that the bottom line for the so-called radical pan-democratic groups is that they should not advocate independence for Hong Kong, and they must explain more fully and precisely what they mean by self-determination, as well as convince others that it is not the same as advocating independence, which should not be difficult to do. This is really Public International Law 201, if there's such a course. I would advise them first to read the much-cited 1998 landmark judgment of the Supreme Court of Canada in the reference re-succession of Quebec case. In that case, the Canadian Supreme Court neatly answered the question as to whether all peoples, on the basis of the recognised right to self-determination, have a right to unilateral succession under international law. It concluded that the right to self-determination does not automatically confer a right to unilateral succession, and a right to succession arises under self-determination and international law in only three situations. Firstly, a people is governed as part of a colonial empire. Secondly, a people is subject to alien subjugation, domination or exploitation. And thirdly, possibly, where a people is denied any meaningful exercise of its right to achieve self-determination within the state of which they form a part. Other than in those three situations, the court stated, people are expected to achieve self-determination within the framework of their existing state. The court went further to say that a state whose government represents the whole of the people, or people within its territory, on a basis of equality without discrimination, and respects the principle of self-determination in its internal arrangements, is entitled to maintain its territorial integrity under international law, and to have that territorial integrity recognised by other states. In short, it seems far-fetched and fanciful to argue that Hong Kong may have any right to unilateral succession under the principle of self-determination, unless Beijing continues to whittle away the rights and freedoms now enjoyed by Hong Kongers, to the point they no longer have any meaningful way to seek political development. Fact is, under international law, all peoples, at least theoretically, have a right to meaningful access to government to pursue their political, economic, cultural and social development under the principle of self-determination. If any pan-democratic group advocates only self-determination, nothing more, they're actually doing something they're entitled to do under international law. It is more worrying still if the method of imprecise and uninformed interpretation of what are, after all, well-known terms with accepted international usage is compounded by a willingness to extend it to cover the situations of those who advocate other political positions, as suggested in your introduction. Thank you very much, Baron. Just one more comment from a listener for the moment on our Facebook page. Henry, there's one, you can go to our Facebook page, Backchat and on RTHK Radio Free, and read the comments there. One extremely long comment from Henry, too long to read out all on air, but let me read out another shorter comment, which relates to yesterday's events. And Nathan Law, I'm not sure if you were there, but perhaps you'd like to respond to this. Henry says, the chaos created by pan-democratic district board members, Agnes Chow, Joshua Wong, etc., trying to get hold of the returning officer for Hong Kong Island, to harass and ridicule her, is typical of the hooligan behaviour of the pan-democrats. Their message is that they would rough up anybody who blocks one way or another their way, paying no respect to any authority or fair play. It's typical of triad members' behaviour to create fear in other people, not to obstruct them. The nature of their action is similar to the pan-democrats escorting Leung and Yao into LegCo chambers. That's the reference to the first two disqualified legislators, Sixes Leung and Yao Wei-ching. Escorting Leung and Yao into LegCo chambers after the LegCo president had issued an order barring them from entering into LegCo chambers. What they did is the law, nothing else. An old Chinese saying is applicable. What have they learnt from school teachers, lecturers, textbooks? I would say nothing. I remember my parents told me many times, stay away and never go near triad members or hooligans. Hooligan behaviour is not the norm of the society. Nathan Law, your response?
Well, definitely, this accusation is groundless. Well, for a lot of pro-establishment camps legislators who have been working with them, they said I'm a polite and reasonable person, that I'm not going inside to make any chaos, but representing people.
How about what was? Were you there yesterday in Eastern District when Agnes Chow and I saw Agnes Chow and Joshua Wong on the TV coverage?
I was not there, but
pretty chaotic scenes.
Incidents, and that was a disastrous event because there are publicly elected councillors that are being blocked to fulfill their duty, which is going to the meeting. And I think the way Henry sees it is, maybe there are pan-democrats making chaos, but the way I see it, I see it from an angle of protecting the councillor, is there are people abusing their power to illegally blocking those councillors who attend meetings. That is a huge insult towards the electoral system, because if you take a close look to the protection to the councillor, they are entitled to go to the meeting, and anyone who block them without reasonable ground are actually committing illegal actions. So I think that is the crucial point of yesterday's event.
Yeah. And I mean, this suggestion that it's equated to violence in triads, I mean, is not kind of. It is totally ridiculous. I mean, the only thing these people are afraid of is answering questions, about what actually happened, especially with the injection of the Secretary for Justice?
Well, let's ask Nathan Law of De Sisto. Is De Sisto going to continue to pursue this returning officer around town? I mean, every time she tries to, she has other functions to fulfill as well. Every time she tries to turn up to a public function, is it your intention to be there until you get answers to, as Agnes Chow said, until you get answers to questions from her?
Well, I think the returning officer owed the public an explanation why she was going to do, or she was disqualifying Agnes Chow. And I think that not only that, for a lot of people, for example, those pan-democrats in the Eastern Council, they also wanted to know the answer. I think for the way to solve the problem is the returning officer coming out brightly and publicly to explain that, why there's no explanation from De Sisto, why she's not asking for our response, and why she's doing political censoring. I think that's the correct way of how to be responsible to the public.
Yeah, and I want to ask our legal eagles, our lawyers, while they're on the line. And what about this suggestion from Eric Jung at the Hong Kong University that the returning officer bypassed a normal procedure when they need advice on these things, that they're supposed to consult a nomination advisory committee composed of outside lawyers, not go to the Secretary of Justice.
Let's go to Richard Ip first, because he has to leave shortly. Richard Ip?
Yes, this is certainly a procedure under the relevant legislation. And given the political importance of the decision, there seems to be no reason at all for them to bypass it. But I think it's pretty clear from the whole episode that it seems a done job. Like they didn't ask any questions; they just disqualified her. So it's a decision made beforehand.
Why do they have to inject the Secretary of Justice into this? I mean, that's just going to make everything look even worse. If it was a done deal, why didn't the returning officer just ban her and not have to go have a visit with Teresa Cheng?
Well, I don't know who in the top makes that decision, but it seems from the way that it's operated that somebody had to make the decision and just execute it.
Lawrence Ma, do you have any concerns about the way this was handled, particularly that issue of procedural justice, Agnes Chow not having a chance to respond to before she's disqualified?
I think I'm not too concerned about the factual issues in this case with respect to whether she's given a chance to respond. Of course, I agree with Bowen that natural justice has to be given to a person, but it seems that whatever explanation she gave could not be effectively in her interest to defend her stance of the statements stated in the website of De Sisto. What my concern is really, after returning from the mainland from a CPPCC meeting this morning, there is a concern that the constitutionality of the legislative of the electoral commission officer's decision may have, as people would have been concerned, that it has contravened the Article 21. Because the decision disqualifies her on the basis of her legal opinion. Now, that is something protected by Article 21.
Article 21, you're not referring to the Basic Law, are you? You're referring to the ICC?
Hong Kong Bill of Rights Ordinance. Yes. So I think if they, I think someone is challenging, someone from Changzhou is launching a judicial review against the government's decision of disqualification. On prima facie reading of Article 21, they may have a case.
And what about this runaround the Nomination Advisory Committee? Is that a big deal, or is that, people just going to ignore
What do you mean, running around?
Well, Eric Jung suggested that the returning officer should not have gone to Secretary of Justice. She should have gone to the Nomination Advisory Committee.
No, the government has to make administrative decisions. When the government makes an administrative decision of disqualification, they have to have legal basis, and they have to because it involves interpretation of many provisions of the law. So, in order to make that decision, the government's decision has to be legally right. So, in order to be legally
right, at least, they have to consult the government lawyer.
Lawrence Meyer, we're going to have to break for the news there, but we're going to continue the discussion after the news. We'll say goodbye for the moment to Nathan Law of Demosisto and Richard Ip of the Progressive Lawyers Group. But
adios, gentlemen.
Further guests join us after the news. If you have any thoughts, do email us at backchat@rthk.hk, backchat@rthk.hk. Later on, we'll be talking about that serious problem in local public hospitals. The weather forecast, it's cloudy with a few rain patches. It's cold. The maximum temperature will be 11 degrees. Currently, it's 9 degrees, and the relative humidity is 96%. Stay with us. We'll be back in 3 minutes.
HK.
Welcome back to Backchat. I'm Danny Gittings. Your co-host is Andrew Work. In the main part of this morning's programme, we're continuing to discuss the ramifications of the disqualification of pro-democracy candidate Agnes Chow. What does this say about the future for pan-democratic groups like Demosisto, to which she belongs? Now they can no longer take part in electoral politics. Will they resort to more radical activities instead? And how far will the ban extend? Will people, for instance, who oppose Article 23 legislation be banned as well? Email us with your thoughts. Our email address, backchat@rthk.hk. That's backchat@rthk.hk. Or go to our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio Free, and leave a comment there. And later in the programme, we'll be talking about the crisis in local hospitals. Now, before we go back to the guests, let me try and bring in a selection of the numerous comments that have been coming in from listeners on this topic. And, of course, we also discussed related issues on yesterday's show, and the comments continued to flow in after the show was over. Mike says, we discuss and argue basic law and democracy and say nothing of court rulings that ignore common law and our basic rights and the basic law. Somehow, Hong Kong is afraid to challenge judges and all their rulings. Courts' independence is important, but independence from what? Consistently poor or incorrect rulings that violate common and or basic law, with judges that have tenure remain a black spot in the process. This really needs better control to keep trust in our system. And we have Jaludin says, to uphold the basic law means to obey it. None of those who were disqualified ever said they would disobey the basic law. They all emphasized their intention to seek amendments or repeal by legal means. If legislators cannot call for changes in the law, we might as well abolish LegCo. And in another comment coming in, Adeline says, despite all the gibberish and half-truth spoken by our Chinese city mayor Lam yesterday, Lam has clearly stated that even promoting Hong Kong local autonomy is now considered outlawed, just as Hong Kong independence. The plot of the film 10 Years has already and unfortunately started in Hong Kong much sooner. I think RTHK and Phil Whelan from the Morning Brew need to play a lovely song called Chinese Child by Zhao Yupeng after Backchat, just to remind us of what we are dealing with here. David, in a long email, excuse me if I shorten it a bit, David says, I am concerned that Miss Carrie Lam, Chief Executive of Hong Kong, could be behind the decision of Miss Anne Teng, Returning Officer, to disbar Agnes Chow from entering the election. Before Mrs. Carrie Lam went to Switzerland to attend Davos, she refused to answer questions as to whether Agnes Chow would be allowed to stand, and said it was solely up to the returning officer. On her return to Hong Kong, however, Mrs. Lam has supported the returning officer's decision to disbar Agnes Chow and said it was entirely by the book. What book? My concerns are reinforced by the reluctance of Miss Teresa Cheng, Secretary for Justice, to admit she had given a legal opinion to the returning officer. Why the reluctance? Is there something to hide? Ms. Cheng also said it was up to the returning officer to make the decision, and then goes on to make a number of points in relation to the returning officer. If Ms. Anne Teng truly is the person to make the decision, she should be held accountable. It's imperative that she's urgently summoned to LegCo to testify and clarify ambiguities. In the meantime, Ms. Carrie Lam and Ms. Teresa Cheng must cease to comment or interfere any further. It's inappropriate for the government to say Agnes can appeal to the courts, knowing that any court hearing and decision will be months after the election date of 11th of March. It's ludicrous that the public are being told to tolerate the deplorable behaviour of the Secretary for Justice in respect of unauthorised structures, but at the same time been denied the right to vote for the candidate of their choice. And just one more email for the moment from Simon. I say maybe a slightly different theme. Simon says, I love listening to your program in the morning on my way to work. The politicians in Hong Kong are just like in any other country. They always let us down. And it seems they're just as selfish as in any other country. Wars and death are caused by the failure of politicians who represent us, but very few are held accountable. What the China government is doing to Hong Kong is the same as politicians all over the world. They're consolidating their power. This is what always happens. It always will. Of course, anti-Beijing groups are being targeted by the Beijing government. This is normal. What does anyone think would happen? The Beijing government is insulting the intelligence of us all by denying it. Carrie Lam is just as spineless as David Cameron. As soon as the former British Prime Minister, as soon as the British people asked him to do something he did not want to do, he resigned. If we all did this, we'd never have any jobs because we'd all have to do things we don't believe in or like because it's our job. And he goes on to refer to events in Britain, privatisation, selling off of gas, water and electricity, and goes on to say, Carrie Lam is the same. She will sell out the Hong Kong people to feather her own nest. Everyone knows this. The new Secretary for Justice, what a joke. We live in a communist dictatorship. Yes, even in Hong Kong. This is a one-party, one-country system. Don't think that as soon as it's not useful to Beijing to have this little bit of freedom, it won't be taken away. Wake up and smell the politics. Don't believe anything a politician says to you because it's not for your or my benefit. It's only to make that individual's life better. Thank you very much, Simon, indeed to all our listeners commenting, and we'll try and bring in further comments later on. Okay, continuing the discussion, Lawrence Ma, barrister and chair of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation, is still with us. We're now also joined by Chung Kim Wah. Chung Kim Wah is the assistant professor at the Department of Applied Social Sciences at Hong Kong Polytechnic University. Chung Kim Wah, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Thank you for joining.
Yes.
Now, we had before the news, we had Nathan Law on trying to ask about the future of groups like his. I mean, what do you think their future is? They're shut out of electoral politics now. Do they take to the streets? Do people drift away? Do they, as my co-host was suggesting earlier, perhaps they reform in a different form?
Yeah, just slap a new label on it so they can get themselves back into elections, or do they take to the streets? I mean,
where do they go, Chung Kim Wah?
Yes, I think of course the organization is a group of very devoted youngsters who are trying to make something change to the society and the system. And they got a lot of support from young people, even though not all people are affiliated with them officially or trying to, or all people agree with everything they say. But they become an icon. If they are DQ'd by the government in that way, I think even though those who are not totally agree with them will feel bad for the decision, and they would try to link this up to the point that the government is trying to disqualify the young people as whole. So I think the decision this time is going to adding momentum to the movement and to the plot, and it's going to polarize young people even more against the government and the establishment. So I think this is not a very wise decision. And the gesture the government show in this decision is also very, very arousing and challenging. And I don't think young people would accept that easily. So even though they are not being qualified to take part in the election, more people, especially young people, would take it to the street, and the impact on the society is going to be even more difficult to predict in the future.
More young people would take to the streets because
not all young people, of course, but at least I would say that if you look into to Facebook and other platforms, you know that for some even more aggressive or even more radical young people group. They argue against the organization. They say that they are too gentle in some sense. But now they all come out to say that this is a totally unacceptable challenge to the younger generation. They put it that way. So I think even though not all young people will take it to the street, but more young people will feel that the establishment is not for them.
they have to do something outside the establishment, and their continuous attack on the system and the government will not be mild down in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, but isn't one of the things here, these things tend to bleed off momentum because, with Hong Kong, as long as the economy is good and as long as people have the option to leave, it's manageable. I mean, people are doing okay. If you're really that unhappy, a lot of people just leave. I mean, a lot of places where people, really get into an uprising mood is because they have nowhere else to go. They have no other options. But in Hong Kong,
of course, there are always opposing forces in the political discourse. But we have to look into one reality. I come into contact with young people quite often in my daily duties.
I heard there are
and I'm sure I can tell you that even some very appear to be very mild, very gentle young people, they sit in the corner of the classroom without making a lot of noises during class and after the class. But if you talk to them outside the classroom, you know that in their mind, they are very unhappy about the existing situation, and they have a very strong feeling that they are being marginalized by the system.
Yeah, but people that have unhappy feelings in their minds stay in jobs they're unhappy with. They stay in marriages they're unhappy with.
Quite popular among young people. They feel that they are being marginalized. They are deprived with a lot of opportunities and chances. They are not able to face up with the future if the system is not going to change in some way according to the imagination. So
but it doesn't matter.
Even though they are not radical,
but
it's quite likely that they would go out to express their will when the chance is there.
But there's no public mood for civil disobedience at the moment.
Of course, at this time.
We saw even Nathan Law. He was on the first half of the program. We asked him what kind of action he's going to take. They talk about lobbying international support and so on. When we ask about civil disobedience, he stays away from it. There's really no public appetite at the moment. Isn't that correct?
At this time, I think the situation is not for that kind of activities, but of course they will go out to plead for international attention when the times come and when the time is right. I would not underestimate the possibility of some very fierce confrontation between these young people and some government official and some other people.
And you mentioned other radical groups that maybe say that Demosisto and so on are too moderate. I mean, we saw a lot of them during the Umbrella Movement, Civic Passion and so on, but they seem to have largely disappeared since then, haven't they? They've faded away.
Of course, how people decide to come out in protest, walk out, is quite complicated. And they may feel that this is not useful. They are not going to react to some public mobilization by some conventional political group, and they do not agree with the tactics they use because they are too gentle and not really going to hit on the major establishment position. So they are not coming out for reason that they believe that it doesn't work. So that's the problem. If they do not fling a gentle walk out, protest is not working. What will they do?
Okay.
When the time is come, right? This is a problem we have to think about.
Okay, we're discussing the future for pan-Democrats, particularly radical pan-Democrat groups. You just heard Chung Kim-wah.
Yes.
Let me just bring in a couple of comments from listeners, because both these comments, maybe they're coming from different perspectives, but they reach a similar conclusion. Firstly, I'll bring in just a short extract from another message from Henry on our Facebook page. Now, this is an extremely long message. I'm not going to read it out all, but just the general sentiments, and you can go to our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio Free, and see the full message there. Henry says, I believe the pandem's future is bleak if their present trajectory remains unchanged. Not only is the window for spearheading their cause very small, the scope and extent are limited by the basic law, relevant National People's Congress decisions, and indirectly the mainland's constitution. Their refusal to acknowledge the mainland's comprehensive authority on Hong Kong, the refusal to see for themselves present-day China, bad-mouthing Hong Kong overseas, filibustering, rascal behaviour, etc., will all backfire on them. the Pandems will increasingly find their theatre increasingly limited. And as I say, you can see the full message on our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio 3. Also on our Facebook page, a message from TC, another regular commentator, often expressing rather different opinions from Henry, but here perhaps reaching the same conclusion as Henry. TC says, in its current state, I believe there is no future for radical pandems, by which I refer to progressive pandems. So for two reasons. Let me try and get through as much as I can of that. One, many progressive pro-democratic organisations are radical in words only. They're expressing radical ideas to gather political capital in their respective candidacies for public office. Not that I'm encouraging it, but members of this group don't look like they're willing to make significant sacrifices for their causes. When Joshua Wong apologises to the court for his actions in hoping for leniency, then I know what he's made of. Did Nelson Mandela, Vladimir Havel and even Mahatma Gandhi ever soften their position in exchange for leniency from the governments of apartheid South Africa, communist Czechoslovakia and colonial India, respectively? Did Martin Luther King end the fight for civil rights for African Americans when assassination threats became real? And then TC goes on to talk about mainstream society in Hong Kong unable to comprehend the underlying cause of radical opposition. You can see the full message on our Facebook page, Backchat on RTHK Radio 3. Thank you very much. Lawrence Ma, you're still with us. I mean, how about? I know you comment primarily from the legal perspective, but are you worried about radical action by pan-democratic groups?
No, I think I sort of want to respond to Dr. Jones just now. I think the government and the central government has, in this situation, sent clear gestures to radical politics to say, hey, if you advocate independence in Hong Kong, that's a no, you can't do it. So I think for young people, they've got to accept that this is the line of the government, and as well as the basic law. So I think you may not like it, but that's a political reality.
Lauren, you said you just came back from a meeting in China with other representatives there. Are they in a lather about this? Do they think that Hong Kong is on the boil and the pandems are, they're about to launch the counter revolution? Are they, because people here seem to think it's pretty much a spent force for now. But are people on the other side of the border? Are they shaking in their boots about this turning into something like another Occupy?
Oh no, I don't. We've never had that opinion. We thought that this is a pretty correct response from the government after all this separatist movement since the occupying central movement, because the political seed for separatists and independence has gathered force since occupying central, and this is a positive response that we think that we by interpreting Basic Law Article 104 is a direct response to tackle separatist movements, and this is part of the you would say steps or part of the collateral of the interpretation effect.
Chung Hin-Wah, just now you were agreeing there's no mood for civil disobedience right now, but you were saying that could change. What sort? I mean, of course, no one really saw the umbrella movement coming in 2014. What could change it? What sort of circumstances could change the mood to where there would be an
It's
acceptance?
difficult to say because the political situation in Hong Kong is quite uncertain in the near future. But I would say that angers are building up. Discontents are building up. So even when people in the against the government are quite diverted and without focus, without a strong leader. But if something unexpected come out, just like several years ago when the problem of national education come out, people would come out. So I think it's difficult to say, and the government should be more careful if something just spark the people. I would say some kind of confrontation could not be ruled out. I would say that.
The people, you referred a lot to Hong Kong disaffection among Hong Kong young people, and of
not
course,
only young people, but Hong Kong
So you think it would spread? I mean, because of course, what we saw in during the Occupying umbrella movement was, to some extent, a big generational divide, wasn't it?
You're right. I think not only young people, but of course, young people will be particularly angry about this recent DQ issues. But many Hong Kong people, if you pay attention to what has been expressed in the media, what has been said about this in the newspaper, I think it's quite easy to come up with this worry.
Yeah, and I have to admit, Daniel, I'll take issue with that. I don't think there was a generational divide. Certainly the young people were the ones staying overnight in Occupy Central and kind of keeping the fires going. But I mean, a lot of older, like really older people and a lot of middle-aged people were down there day in, day out, to show their support and things. They just, they got jobs and kids and all that kind of stuff, so they can't sleep over for weeks and weeks. But there was it wasn't just a young people thing for sure. And I think at this point, some people are quite hopeless about the future, quite hopeless about there could possibly be any change in the government itself. So they are quite hopeless and quite angry. And I think this kind of hopeless and angry would eventually lead to a situation that they would become, in sociological terms, they would become an anomie situation. That means they don't believe in any conventional values. They don't believe in the norms and expectations anymore. And at that point, it's difficult to say what they would behave and how they would react to the situation.
Okay,
so
thank you.
This is a very risky situation. The government had to be alert about that.
Thank you very much. You just heard Chung Kim Wah, Assistant Professor of Department of Applied Social Sciences, Hong Kong Polytechnic University, saying Hong Kong is moving into a very risky situation. And thank you also very much to Lawrence Ma, barrister and chair of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation, who's been with us from the beginning of the discussion. And thank you, of course, to all our listeners. A lot of listeners having strong feelings about this topic, as we've been seeing in our shows over the past few days. And I know that we'll be returning to the topic again in future.